In 2009, the Harper family believed it was just another Saturday in their quiet Midwestern town. Their daughter, Emily, 16 years old and proud to be part of the high school choir, had boarded a bus that morning with 23 other students and their director. The group was headed to a regional competition hosted at a historic church in a neighboring county. For Emily's parents, there was nothing unusual about the day. They expected the bus to return late, tired voices mixed with laughter, medals clutched in eager hands. Instead, they received a phone call that changed everything. Their daughter had never gotten back on the bus. The choir's performance went smoothly that afternoon. Teachers remembered Emily singing with the alto section, following her sheet music without error. Friends recalled her smiling during the applause, relieved that weeks of practice were over. Photos taken by a parent in the audience show her in the second row, hands clasped, hair tied back with the choir's signature ribbon. Nothing about her appearance suggested trouble. Afterward, the group gathered outside by the church steps, waiting for the bus that would take them home. Witnesses later said Emily broke off briefly, telling a friend she needed to grab something she had forgotten. That was the last moment anyone could confirm her movements with certainty. When the bus pulled out that evening, every student was expected to be seated. Roll call was done in a hurry. Some kids were chatting, others dozing against the windows. No one noticed an empty space until the bus pulled into the high school parking lot nearly an hour later. The director, assuming Emily had traveled with a parent, dismissed the absence at first. Only after frantic calls to her mother went unanswered did reality begin to set in. Emily had not returned home. She had not traveled with another family. She was missing. That night, police were called. Officers interviewed the choir director, the bus driver, and the students who had been near Emily before she walked away. Confusion reigned. Some claimed they saw her near the church's side entrance, while others thought they spotted her across the street near a convenience store. None of it added up. Officers searched the bus, the parking lot, and the church grounds by flashlight. The hope was simple. Maybe she had fallen asleep somewhere, or gone to the restroom and been overlooked. By dawn, it was clear those answers were wishful thinking. Emily's disappearance spread quickly. Her parents drove to the church before sunrise, joining officers combing through the grounds. The church, an old stone structure with a tall bell tower, was quiet and locked. Custodians insisted no one had been inside after the concert. Volunteers fanned out in groups, walking the nearby fields and wooded areas. They called her name, hoping she had simply wandered. The only trace recovered was her sheet music folder, found in the choir's assigned waiting room. Her backpack, phone, and personal belongings were missing. In the first 24 hours, investigators considered every possibility. Could she have chosen to run away? Emily's friends rejected the idea. They described her as dependable, the kind of girl who wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. Teachers echoed that. She had shown no signs of distress, no behavior that suggested a planned departure. As the hours passed, police shifted their stance. This was not a runaway. Something more serious had occurred. By the second day, the search widened. State troopers joined local police, scouring highways and rural backroads. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning fields with thermal imaging. Police dogs were brought in, following Emily's scent across the church courtyard. The trail ended abruptly near the side of the bell tower. No one could explain how it disappeared so suddenly. Detectives interviewed townspeople who had been at the concert. A handful recalled seeing a girl who looked like Emily talking to someone in a dark jacket near the parking lot, but none could confirm the detail with certainty. At the Harper home, fear turned into anguish. Emily's mother described the hours as a blur of ringing phones and empty hope. Her father struggled to answer questions from police about whether Emily had conflicts, secrets, or hidden friendships. For a while, the family clung to the idea that Emily might call from a bus station or a friend's house. That call never came. By the end of that first week, the missing posters were everywhere, stapled to telephone poles, pinned to church doors, handed out at grocery stores. Each poster carried the same image. Emily smiling, choir uniform crisp, the words, "Missing, last seen." September 12, 2009. The community gathered nightly for prayer vigils. Candlelight lit the same streets where officers returned each evening empty-handed. The early days of an investigation are often the most crucial. For Emily, they yielded confusion, suspicion, and no clear direction. Authorities warned her parents to prepare for a long process. Hope remained, but so did an unshakable fear. If she had not run away, then someone, somewhere, had taken her. And in that small town, people began to look at each other differently, wondering who among them might know the truth. It would not take long for the theories to grow louder, and every theory seemed to circle back to the same unsettling detail. Emily was last seen near the church, steps from the old tower whose doors had been locked for decades. Witness accounts of the hours after the concert would become the foundation of the case, but they were fragile, shifting depending on who was asked and how much time had passed. Several of Emily's closest friends agreed on one detail. After the choir finished and the group was dismissed, she mentioned needing to go back inside the church to grab something. One friend thought it was her music folder. Another swore she said her sweater. Either way, Emily walked back toward the heavy wooden doors of the church while most of the group clustered near the bus. That was the last time anyone could clearly remember her with confidence. The church itself was old, with thick stone walls and a bell tower that dominated the skyline of the small town. For decades, its tower had been closed to the public, the entrance sealed with rusting locks. Only custodians carried the keys. Longtime parishioners said the doors hadn't been opened in years. The interior was familiar to the choir members: rows of pews, a raised stage, a side room where they had stored their belongings during the competition. But it was also filled with hidden corners, dim stairwells, and doors that led to forgotten storage spaces. If Emily had re-entered the building, her options were many. Investigators quickly asked about security cameras. The church had only one. An outdated system installed above the side entrance meant more as a deterrent than real surveillance. The footage was grainy, barely functioning in low light. Yet when officers reviewed the tape, they noticed something unsettling. At 6:47 p.m., roughly the time Emily would have gone inside, a shape moved across the frame near the base of the bell tower. It was indistinct, little more than a blur, but large enough to be human. The image was too degraded to confirm whether it was Emily. What unsettled police was that the tower was supposed to be locked. Detectives began canvassing the area. They interviewed the choir director again, pressing for details. He admitted he hadn't watched Emily closely once the performance ended. Students were dispersing, gathering their things, calling parents. He assumed she was with the group. The bus driver said he had been focused on traffic and didn't see who boarded last. Parents in the audience, lingering in the parking lot, recalled seeing a girl in the same maroon choir outfit walk near the side of the church, but none could say definitively it was Emily. As news of the missing teenager spread, the community began to talk. Rumors sprouted quickly. Some claimed Emily had been corresponding with an older boy, maybe even an older man. Others whispered about secret notes exchanged during choir practice. In the absence of answers, every small observation became a potential lead. Friends reported seeing Emily texting during rehearsals, more distracted than usual. A teacher admitted she had seemed preoccupied in the weeks before, though nothing that stood out as alarming at the time. Detectives followed every thread. They pulled phone records, discovering a series of calls and messages to an unregistered prepaid number. The communication stopped the day she vanished. Attempts to trace it went nowhere. The number was inactive within hours of her disappearance. Meanwhile, officers checked local motels and bus stations, showing Emily's photo to clerks and attendants. No one recognized her. Attention then turned back to the church staff. Custodians and maintenance workers were interviewed one by one. Each insisted the tower was locked that night. Keys were logged, accounted for. But one custodian admitted something unusual. A door had been left unlatched earlier in the week during routine maintenance. He claimed he had secured it before the concert, but investigators wondered if it had been overlooked or tampered with. Theories spread among the townspeople. Some believed Emily had been lured back by someone she trusted, perhaps to meet privately before leaving. Others suspected she stumbled upon something inside the church she wasn't meant to see. In a small town, speculation cut deeply. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. The church, once a place of comfort, became a backdrop for whispers about what secrets its tower and halls might hide. Friends struggled with guilt. Several replayed the moment they saw Emily walk away, asking themselves if they should have followed her, insisted she stay with the group, or at least checked when she didn't come back quickly. Instead, they boarded the bus, assuming she was already on. By the time they realized the mistake, it was too late. For investigators, the focus narrowed on the gap of just a few minutes, the time between Emily stepping away and the bus pulling out. Someone could have intercepted her in that window, unseen by the group distracted with loading instruments and chatting with parents. That possibility turned the investigation darker. If she hadn't chosen to vanish, then someone had taken her. And if they had, it might have happened inside the very building where she had just performed. The blurry figure on the camera remained the only piece of visual evidence, and it raised more questions than answers. Was it Emily returning to the tower doors, or someone else moving there deliberately, knowing the choir had left? Detectives pressed for clarity, but technology at the time couldn't sharpen the footage further. It became an image families recognized from news reports, a shadow near the bell tower that might hold the truth. By the end of that second week, the case had shifted from confusion to fear. What began as a missing person report was now treated as suspicious disappearance. Leads pulled investigators in every direction, talk of a boyfriend no one could name, whispers about an older man in the audience, stories about notes never found. Each possibility only deepened the unease. And through it all, the church tower loomed over the town, locked, silent, and carrying with it the chilling possibility that Emily's last steps had led straight toward it. The search around the church began within hours of Emily being reported missing. Officers cordoned off the grounds, focusing on the areas she was last seen. By mid-morning, police dogs were deployed, handlers guiding them carefully through the courtyard and narrow paths that surrounded the stone building. Almost immediately, the dogs picked up her scent near the steps where the choir had gathered. They followed the trail across the yard and toward the heavy wooden doors at the base of the bell tower. For investigators, this detail carried weight. If Emily had returned inside, it meant she was steps away from a place that had been locked for years. But just as the dogs reached the threshold, the trail went cold. The scent didn't continue inside. It ended at the doors, as though she had either entered or been taken away at that exact point. Detectives pressed the church staff for answers. A custodian assigned to lock up that night said he had performed his normal duties, walking through the sanctuary and adjoining rooms before leaving around 9 p.m. He swore he saw nothing unusual. The choir director, questioned again, added a troubling piece of context. He admitted Emily had seemed distracted all week, quieter than usual during rehearsals. At first, he assumed it was nerves about the competition, but looking back, he couldn't shake the impression she had been carrying a burden no one else knew about. The implication was enough to push detectives toward two possibilities. Either she had walked off willingly, or someone had been watching her and knew she was vulnerable. Forensic teams swept the inside of the church, dusting door handles and scanning for prints. Nothing conclusive emerged. The sanctuary looked untouched, the side rooms undisturbed. The tower remained locked, its keys accounted for. Investigators even climbed the narrow stairwell up toward the bells, searching for signs of tampering. They found dust, old wood, and iron machinery, nothing that suggested a teenager had been inside just hours earlier. To the officers on scene, it felt like searching a maze where every path circled back to the same dead end. Then came the discovery that complicated the picture further. 2 days after her disappearance, a passerby reported finding a backpack in an alley 2 blocks from the church. It was quickly identified as Emily's. Inside were school binders, a choir ribbon, and a pack of gum she'd carried everywhere. Missing, however, were 2 important items, her cell phone and her personal journal. Detectives could not determine whether the backpack had been left intentionally or dumped in haste. Its placement, away from the direct search grid, suggested staging. Someone might have wanted investigators to believe Emily had left on her own. The community wrestled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, the backpack meant she had been outside the church grounds at some point. On the other, the missing items implied interference. Police began to treat the scene as potentially manipulated. Questions multiplied. If she left the church voluntarily, why discard her bag without the most personal belongings? If she was forced, why would her abductor remove only her phone and journal? Rumors gained traction in town. Parents speculated about the journal, whispering it could contain secrets she didn't want others to read. Teenagers whispered about hidden crushes, falling outs with friends, or possible arguments at home. Detectives interviewed classmates again, probing for tensions. Some mentioned Emily had grown distant, others insisted she was fine. None of it created a clear picture. Attention returned to the custodians. If Emily's scent ended at the tower doors, how could no one have noticed her? Investigators scrutinized the custodial logbook. Everything appeared routine. Times noted, rooms checked off. Still, the timing gnawed at them. If the dogs were correct, her last known position was outside doors only a handful of people had access to. The lead detective admitted privately that the most troubling part of the case wasn't what they had found, but what they hadn't. In the weeks that followed, the backpack became a symbol of frustration. It was evidence, but evidence that told two stories at once. Either Emily had staged her own disappearance and carried only the items she deemed most private, or someone had stripped those things from her to control the narrative. The lack of clarity deepened the divide between those who believed she had run away and those convinced she had been taken. For the Harper family, every new detail felt like sand slipping through their fingers. Emily's mother clung to the backpack when it was returned, insisting her daughter would never have abandoned it on her own. Her father grew quieter, staring at the missing phone records with a mix of anger and despair. Detectives worked to subpoena carriers, but without the device itself, progress was slow. The search inside the church yielded nothing definitive. Officers began expanding outward, canvassing surrounding businesses and neighborhoods. Witnesses were re-interviewed, timelines reconstructed again and again. But the path always circled back to the churchyard, the dogs, and that final scent trail that vanished against locked wood. For investigators, it felt less like a trail gone cold and more like one deliberately cut short. And that raised a chilling question. If someone had staged part of this disappearance, what else might they have staged to keep the truth hidden? The disappearance of a child is never just a private tragedy. Within days, the Harper family's grief was under a public microscope, their every word and gesture scrutinized by neighbors, reporters, and investigators desperate for answers. Emily's parents, Margaret and David, stood on their front porch for the first press conference, clutching a printed school photo of their daughter. Margaret's voice shook as she pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. She stressed one detail over and over again: Emily would not have run away. She was close to her family, dependable, and would never have left without saying goodbye. To her, the very suggestion was insulting. But for detectives, they had to consider every possibility, even the one her parents refused to entertain. In the days that followed, the house filled with reporters parked outside and family members inside, trying to offer support. Yet the pressure revealed cracks long buried. Old disputes surfaced as relatives gave conflicting interviews to journalists. An aunt hinted Emily might have been restless, that she sometimes talked about wanting more than the small town could offer. A cousin described arguments between Emily and her father over curfews. Each offhand remark became fodder for speculation, printed in bold headlines that suggested Emily had planned her own disappearance. Margaret fought back against those claims, sitting for multiple interviews where she repeated her certainty. Emily had not left by choice. She believed her daughter had been taken. David, however, was less certain. Under questioning, he admitted Emily had grown more private in the months before the competition. She had started spending more time alone in her room, locking her journal, keeping her phone close. He assumed it was the normal withdrawal of a teenager, the kind of distance that eventually resolves. but in hindsight, he wondered if it had been something more. His honesty, though well-intentioned, fueled reporters eager for a narrative of secrets and rebellion. Headlines began to split the story into two camps. Was Emily abducted, or had she chosen to vanish? Detectives focused on the details hidden behind her father's comments. They subpoenaed Emily's phone records, hoping to find evidence of communication with someone outside her circle of friends. What they uncovered was both promising and frustrating. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Emily had exchanged a string of calls and text messages with a prepaid number. The number was registered under no name, and the account was closed the same night she went missing. The pattern suggested intention. Whoever had been on the other end wanted to vanish as completely as Emily had. This discovery shifted the investigation into new territory. Police questioned classmates, asking if anyone had seen Emily meeting someone privately or receiving notes. Some admitted they had seen her step aside during rehearsals to check her phone more than once. One friend said she thought Emily was hiding a smile after a call, though she could never confirm who was on the other end. Another insisted she had overheard Emily whispering late at night during a choir trip earlier in the season, but the details were too vague to pursue. The Harper home became a place of constant interrogation. Detectives returned again and again, pressing the parents for names of friends, asking to search Emily's room. They found little beyond the ordinary trappings of a teenage girl: posters, notebooks, a few handwritten letters from friends. The journal that might have explained her behavior remained missing, taken along with her phone. Without them, her state of mind in the days before she vanished was guesswork. Margaret grew increasingly combative as the case dragged on. She refused to accept any theory that suggested her daughter had left willingly. She described Emily as thoughtful and considerate, the kind of girl who helped her younger brother with homework and planned to apply to college. To Margaret, nothing in her daughter's behavior suggested escape. For David, the truth was harder to hold. He replayed their last conversations, recalling moments where she had been evasive, where she shut down questions about who she was talking to on the phone. He told investigators he couldn't shake the feeling that she had been hiding something, even if he didn't know what. The rift between the parents became visible. Margaret lashed out at the media for twisting their story, while David's admissions fed those very narratives. Reporters began publishing contrasting quotes, painting Margaret as clinging to denial and David as resigned to darker possibilities. Behind closed doors, arguments flared. Neighbors later recalled shouting late at night, followed by days of silence. The disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It was fracturing the very family it had stolen from. Still, detectives remained focused on the prepaid number. They traced its purchase to a convenience store 2 towns away, paid for with cash. The security footage from the date of purchase had long since been erased. Without a name, without a device, the lead stalled. But its implications were clear. Emily had been in contact with someone she didn't want others to know about, and whoever that person was had vanished with her, at least in the digital sense. The discovery reignited rumors in town. Was Emily seeing someone older? Was she lured into the church that night under the promise of secrecy? Or was it a peer, another teenager hiding in plain sight, who orchestrated the meeting? None of the questions could be answered, but each one deepened the sense that the case was spiraling further from clarity. For the Harpers, the phone records confirmed the worst kind of fear. Not only had their daughter been keeping secrets, but those secrets might have placed her directly in harm's way. The tension between hope and despair defined those weeks. Margaret continued to stand before cameras, insisting Emily would come home. David began to retreat, quieter in interviews, staring more often at the empty chair at the family's dining table. Investigators pressed on, but without the phone or journal, every theory remained speculative. And in the shadow of that absence, the story of Emily Harper was no longer just about a missing girl. It had become a mirror, reflecting suspicion back onto the family, the town, and everyone who claimed to have known her. As the weeks turned into months, one truth became unavoidable. Whatever answers lay at the center of this case were buried deep, hidden by someone who had calculated every move. And the clearest clue investigators had, the mysterious number that vanished overnight, was as cold as the trail itself. In the weeks that followed Emily Harper's disappearance, the search widened beyond the church grounds and into the vast rural landscape that surrounded the town. Volunteers, law enforcement, and local firefighters combed rivers and drainage ditches, moving through woods thick with undergrowth and abandoned farmhouses left to decay on the edges of the county. Search parties left at dawn and returned late, exhausted and empty-handed. Helicopters scanned fields from above, while cadaver dogs sniffed through barns and cellars that hadn't been opened in years. Each effort ended the same way, with no trace of Emily. The silence of those empty places began to weigh heavily on the community. Hope sparked briefly when a bus driver on a nearby route came forward with a possible sighting. He claimed he had seen a girl who resembled Emily standing on the shoulder of a rural highway, her thumb out like she was trying to hitch a ride. But the timing didn't fit perfectly, and the description was vague. He could not confirm it was her, and there was no further evidence to support the sighting. Investigators checked traffic cameras, but no usable footage existed from that stretch of road. The lead withered within days, yet it lingered as one more possibility in a case already drowning in them. As the search dragged into its third week, detectives identified a potential suspect, a drifter with a record of petty crimes and trespassing who had been arrested just miles from the church. He was questioned intensively after being spotted loitering near a gas station the night Emily vanished. Some in town believed the case was finally breaking open. The man had no alibi and matched vague descriptions of someone seen near the concert grounds. But DNA evidence quickly cleared him. Nothing tied him to Emily's backpack, her belongings, or the churchyard. What had felt like a breakthrough dissolved into another disappointment, one more lead collapsing under scrutiny. The constant cycle of rumors and false starts began to erode trust. Families who once prayed together at the church now whispered about cover-ups and corruption. Some accused the police of incompetence, claiming they had missed vital clues in the first days of the search. Others suggested the church itself had pressured investigators to keep certain areas off limits, protecting its reputation at the expense of the truth. Officers publicly denied those claims, but the damage was done. In a small town where everyone knew each other, suspicion had become the dominant language. Meanwhile, the Harper family struggled with the brutal rhythm of hope and despair. Margaret attended every vigil, standing with a candle in hand as neighbors promised not to give up. David grew quieter, speaking less to the press, staring more often at the empty chair at their dining table. Their marriage began to bear the visible strain of public life lived under a magnifying glass. Some nights, relatives stayed over just to ensure they ate and slept. Each morning, the reality hit again. Emily was still missing, and the questions remained unanswered. Posters with Emily's photo were plastered on every utility pole, taped in store windows, and pinned on bulletin boards at schools and community centers. For a time, her face was unavoidable, a constant reminder of the girl who had walked into a church and never come out. But as the weeks turned to months, those posters began to fade. Rain smeared the ink, edges curled in the wind. Eventually, new announcements covered them. Yard sales, lost pets, church fundraisers. Where Emily's name once hung, silence began to replace urgency. The investigation slowed under the weight of exhaustion. Detectives admitted they had no new evidence, no new witnesses, and no clear direction. The phone number traced to the burner remained a dead end. The backpack, stripped of its most important items, gave no further answers. Rumors about secret relationships or family disputes swirled louder than any confirmed facts. With no credible leads, the case file thickened without resolution. Officially, the investigation was marked as suspended, pending new evidence. Unofficially, it meant the trail was cold. For the town, the absence became a wound. Choir rehearsals continued, but attendance dwindled. Parents hesitated to let their children travel for competitions. Some families stopped going to the church altogether, unsettled by its association with the disappearance. And yet, the building itself still stood, its tower rising above the streets, a silent reminder of the night Emily vanished. By the end of that first year, Emily Harper was no longer the breaking news story she had once been. She had become another face among thousands, her photo part of a database of missing persons, her name spoken mostly at vigils or in quiet conversations when neighbors passed the church at night. For her family, the hardest part was not just the absence, but the stillness that followed. The investigation had stopped moving, and with it, the fragile sense of progress that kept hope alive. In 2010, the lead detective summarized the case in a single line during a press conference. "Unless new information comes forward, there is nowhere else to go." The words echoed through the Harper home. For Margaret, it was unthinkable that her daughter's story could end in silence. For David, it felt like confirmation of what he had already feared, that the truth might remain buried forever. And for the town, it meant that Emily Harper was no longer just missing. She was suspended in time, her fate locked away with secrets no one seemed able or willing to uncover. 15 years passed, and the silence around Emily Harper's case became its own kind of presence. By 2024, the story had shifted from a headline to a memory carried uneasily by those who had lived through it. For her family, time did not soften the loss. Margaret Harper still lit a candle every September in the churchyard, standing alone where vigils once drew hundreds. She clung to the hope that an answer existed, even if she might never hear it. Her husband, David, had withdrawn almost completely. He rarely spoke to reporters anymore, avoided community events, and left town whenever anniversaries drew unwanted attention. Where Margaret remained defiant, David seemed hollowed out, convinced that what had been taken from them was beyond recovery. The community had changed too. The choir program, once the pride of the high school, dwindled year by year. Parents hesitated to enroll their children in out-of-town competitions. Students whispered about curses and bad luck, and the memory of Emily's disappearance hovered over every rehearsal. By 2015, the choir was cut to half its former size. By 2018, it barely existed at all. What should have been a source of joy had become a reminder of loss. The church itself carried that weight most visibly. Generations of families had worshipped there, but after Emily vanished, attendance steadily declined. Teenagers told each other stories about the girl in the tower, daring one another to step onto the grounds at night. The bell tower, locked for decades, loomed as a symbol of something unresolved and untouchable. Detectives who once worked the case retired. Their notes and evidence were boxed away, filed under cold cases in the county archive. New investigators inherited the files, but admitted privately there was little chance of movement. No new tips had surfaced, no new witnesses had come forward. To law enforcement, Emily Harper had become another unsolved line in an overcrowded ledger. To the community, she remained a question mark, a presence felt in glances at faded posters and whispered prayers. In the summer of 2024, a renovation project finally reached the church. Decades of weather had eroded the roof, and the old bell tower, with its cracked beams and rusted supports, was deemed unsafe. Contractors were hired to reinforce the structure. Scaffolding rose around the stone walls, workers climbing higher into spaces no one had entered in years. For most, it was routine labor, patching what time and neglect had damaged. For others, the project stirred unease, memories of the missing girl whose trail ended at those very doors. It was in late June, during one of these restoration shifts, that workers stumbled upon something hidden. While removing rotted planks near the upper section of the tower, a carpenter's crowbar struck hollow wood. Behind a panel, sealed tightly and painted to match the rest of the interior, was a concealed space no more than a few feet deep. The workers expected perhaps old tools or forgotten equipment. Instead, when the panel was pried away, they revealed a crawl space, a deliberately sealed wooden compartment wedged beneath the bell platform itself. Inside, there were no immediate signs of Emily, no body, no clear answer. But the discovery was enough to stop work instantly. Authorities were called. The space had been sealed carefully, its edges nailed and concealed as if someone had gone to great lengths to make it disappear into the tower. Dust and cobwebs covered the surface, suggesting it had been undisturbed for years. When police arrived, they secured the site, treating it not as a construction anomaly, but as a potential crime scene. After 15 years of stillness, the investigation into Emily Harper was suddenly alive again. News of the crawl space spread quickly. Residents gathered near the churchyard as investigators carried equipment up the narrow stairs. Margaret was among them, called by a friend who had heard the first reports. She stood at the base of the tower, staring upward as officers moved in and out. For her, it was a moment heavy with possibility. After years of unanswered questions, there was now something tangible, something hidden in the very place where her daughter's trail had ended. David did not join her. He remained at home, avoiding the renewed attention, unable to face the flood of hope and dread he no longer believed could end in resolution. Inside the tower, detectives and forensic teams began documenting the space. The crawl space was crude but intentional, as though someone had built it for concealment. Wooden boards lined the interior, their edges uneven, nails hammered in hastily but with purpose. Dust and fragments of fabric clung to the corners. It was clear this was not simply a structural oddity. It was a hidden chamber, deliberately sealed. Investigators worked carefully, removing debris, photographing every detail, searching for clues that could explain why it had been created and what, if anything, had once been kept inside. For the community, the discovery reignited old fears. The story of Emily Harper had never truly gone away, but this revelation made it immediate again. People gathered outside the church, whispering, trading theories, watching the tower with a mix of fascination and dread. The teenagers who once spoke of legends about the girl in the tower now saw their stories take on a chilling weight. The sealed crawl space confirmed what many had always suspected, that something had been hidden inside the very building where she was last seen. What investigators would uncover next, inside that hidden chamber, would determine whether Emily Harper's fate remained sealed in mystery or finally stepped into the light. When investigators finally entered the crawl space beneath the bells, they found themselves staring at a space no larger than a closet. It was crude and suffocating, the boards nailed together without precision but with intent, as if someone had built it quickly to hide something, or someone. Dust coated every surface. In the far corner, a bundle of fabric lay rotting, its original color lost to years of damp, air, and neglect. Next to it was a length of chain, rusted through, its links fused in places, as though it had been left untouched for more than a decade. For the officers present, the sight was enough to confirm what many had long suspected. This was no storage compartment. It was a place designed to conceal, and perhaps to contain. They combed carefully through the debris, documenting every scrap. The bundle of fabric turned out to be fragments of choir uniforms and blankets, rolled tightly together. Investigators could not immediately determine if they belonged to Emily, but the symbolism was difficult to ignore. Mixed in with the fabric was the object that changed everything, a broken flip phone, its casing cracked, its buttons worn. Despite the years of decay, the serial number was still visible. Cross-referencing with old evidence logs confirmed it belonged to Emily Harper. After 15 years, her most personal possession had reappeared, hidden in a space no one was meant to find. The phone was transferred to a forensic lab. Specialists knew the chances of recovering data after so much time were slim. But the SIM card, protected inside the casing, remained intact. With careful work, fragments of information were retrieved. Among them were partial contacts, old timestamps, and most importantly, a series of unsent text messages. One draft stood out. "Someone is watching me." They said not to leave. The message was never completed, never sent, but its presence told investigators that Emily had been afraid and that someone else had been there with her. The release of this discovery sent shockwaves through the community. News outlets seized on the line, broadcasting it across the state. For families who had once believed Emily might have run away, the phone silenced those theories. She had not chosen to leave. She had been cornered, intimidated, and cut off before she could reach for help. The church, once a symbol of tradition, now stood as the scene of an unspoken crime, its tower no longer a place of faith but of unanswered horror. Detectives reopened the case with urgency. The phone records that had once led to a prepaid number now carried new weight. Who had Emily been speaking to in those final weeks? And had that person been the one waiting in the church that night? They returned to old evidence, re-examining logs, checking for overlooked details. Even retired officers were called back to review their notes. Forensic teams tested the rusted chain, though no usable DNA remained. They analyzed the fabric, but time had stripped it of identifiable fibers. The crawlspace itself revealed no fingerprints, only the intent of whoever had constructed it, to hide something from discovery. Margaret Harper sat for another interview, her voice breaking as she read the line from her daughter's phone. For her, it was confirmation of what she had said all along, that Emily did not walk away willingly. David, too, returned to the public. Briefly, speaking softly, his words strained. He admitted he had lived 15 years believing they would never find anything more, and now, to hold evidence that his daughter had been alive in those final moments, it was almost unbearable. Theories reignited. Some pointed again to church staff, questioning whether custodians or maintenance workers had used their keys to grant access that night. Others suspected someone from the community, someone Emily trusted enough to follow back inside. The idea that she had been forced into the crawlspace, silenced before she could send her message, became the most plausible explanation. Yet without more evidence, no single suspect emerged. What the crawlspace revealed was damning, but what it didn't reveal was worse. There were no remains, no conclusive signs of what happened after the message was typed. The discovery reopened the case, but left investigators staring at the same blank wall. Emily had been there, she had been afraid, and she had vanished anyway. For the town, the story grew heavier. The church tower became a landmark not of faith, but of fear. Teenagers who once joked about the girl in the tower stopped laughing, realizing the legend had been closer to truth than they ever imagined. Candlelight vigils returned, this time crowded again with faces from across the county. For many, the phone was the first physical connection to Emily since 2009, a bridge between her last moments and the present. Still, the question loomed: who had built the crawlspace, and why had it remained hidden for 15 years? Investigators knew the answers might be buried deeper, in records, in old logs, perhaps in the hands of someone who had stayed quiet all these years. The crawlspace was no longer just a concealed compartment. It was a reminder that someone had been inside those walls with Emily, and that someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the truth never came out. Forensic technicians worked tirelessly to recover every possible fragment from Emily Harper's flip phone. What they found was devastating and clarifying at the same time. Among the drafts and fragments, several unsent texts painted a picture of a girl who hadn't wandered off but had been pulled back into the church against her better judgment. One half-composed message read, "I'm supposed to meet," before it cut off. Another draft simply said, "It's inside." And then the chilling final fragment already made public. "Someone is watching me. They said not to leave." Each incomplete sentence suggested Emily had been in communication, expecting someone, and then suddenly cut off before she could explain. Cell tower records from that night, reanalyzed with newer software, placed her phone's last ping within the footprint of the church itself, inside or directly beneath the bell tower. This data, paired with the hidden crawl space, formed a timeline investigators could no longer ignore. Emily had re-entered. The church, willingly or under instruction, reached the tower and then ceased communication forever. To police, it suggested luring, not chance. Detectives, some of them new to the case and others retired, but recalled for their knowledge, shifted focus back to church records and staff logs. The building had always been central to her last movements, but now it was undeniable. Keys were tightly controlled, supposedly only accessible to custodians and maintenance staff. Yet one name kept surfacing: a part-time employee who had quietly left his position only a few months after Emily's disappearance. His departure at the time was explained as a family move out of state, but when investigators dug deeper, they learned the truth. He had not relocated with family, but simply walked away from his job, never offering a clear explanation. The man's name was released publicly only after his death was confirmed. He had died in 2016, years before the crawlspace discovery, never once interrogated fully about Emily's case. His record immediately raised alarm. Complaints from parishioners described him as intrusive, lingering near young volunteers, making comments that were dismissed as odd but not criminal. Parents had reported uncomfortable encounters, but none were escalated beyond verbal warnings. Church leadership at the time had logged the incidents, but chose to handle them internally, avoiding scandal. Those reports sat buried in file cabinets until now. For the Harper family, this revelation was almost unbearable. Margaret openly accused both law enforcement and church officials of negligence. Had those complaints been taken seriously in 2009, she argued, Emily's case might have been solved before it went cold. Other families joined in her outrage, realizing their own children might have been near the same man during choir practices, youth events, or after services. What once looked like oversight now resembled willful ignorance. Detectives reconstructed the man's timeline during the critical months of 2009. He had access to the tower keys. He was on shift the evening of the concert, though his role was supposedly limited to cleanup. And, most damning, his employment record showed gaps and inconsistencies during the weeks after Emily's disappearance. In hindsight, the details screamed for scrutiny. Yet back then, investigators had been consumed with dead-end suspects and false leads, overlooking the employee in favor of more sensational theories. The discovery that he had died years earlier robbed the community of answers. He could no longer be questioned, no longer pressed to explain his movements, his access, or why he had left abruptly. Without his testimony, the case remained stitched together with circumstantial evidence. Families felt cheated, not just of resolution, but of accountability. The man's death sealed away whatever he might have confessed, leaving only records that hinted at something darker. News of the recovered. Texts and the resurfaced staff files reignited the community's fury. Parents who had children in the choir at the time gathered to demand explanations from both the church and police department. Meetings grew tense, voices rising with accusations that officials had chosen image over action, failing to pursue someone who had been hiding in plain sight. Former students of the choir began speaking out publicly, recalling moments when they felt watched or followed inside the building. What might have once been dismissed as teenage nerves now read as warnings overlooked. For investigators, the task became one of salvaging credibility. They admitted the staff member had been poorly vetted, his complaints brushed aside, his sudden departure accepted too easily. But without forensic evidence directly tying him to the crawlspace or Emily's belongings, the case still lacked the smoking gun needed to close it. He remained a figure of suspicion, not a confirmed perpetrator. Margaret Harper sat again before cameras, her voice quieter now but edged with fury. She said the church had failed her daughter, the police had failed her daughter, and that Emily's silence had been prolonged not just by the one who lured her inside, but by every system that allowed the trail to go cold. David stood beside her, saying little, his face drawn, carrying the look of a man who knew answers might never fully come. In the end, the phone revealed more than just Emily's fear. It exposed the chain of neglect and missed chances that had shadowed the investigation from the very beginning. Each unsent message was not only Emily's voice reaching across time, but also a reminder of how close the truth might have been, had someone listened. And though the man most suspected was now buried, what investigators would find next in the church would suggest that his shadow lingered long after his death. When investigators combed deeper through the contents of the crawlspace, they uncovered more than just Emily's phone and scraps of fabric. Tucked between the boards was a small, dust-covered notebook, its spine cracked with age. It was not Emily's journal, but a maintenance ledger, one used to record keys issued, doors unlocked, and work performed inside the church. At first glance, it looked mundane, filled with brief notations about light bulbs replaced, floors mopped, and doors secured. But one entry stood out with chilling clarity. Dated the exact night Emily vanished, it read simply, "Tower unlocked." Beside the entry were the initials of the custodian who had left his position only months later, the same man who died in 2016 without ever answering questions. The entry was enough to raise immediate suspicion. The tower was supposed to remain sealed at all times. No public event required access to it. No rehearsal or competition would have involved its keys. Yet, here was written proof that on the night Emily disappeared, the doors had been opened under the authorization of someone with access. To investigators, it felt less like a clerical note and more like a breadcrumb, leading straight to the only person who could have made it happen. It reframed the entire case. Emily hadn't wandered randomly toward a locked tower. She had been drawn to a place someone deliberately prepared for her. Forensic teams returned to the crawl space, scrutinizing every surface. Beneath the dust and decay, they noticed faint markings etched into the wooden boards. They weren't random scratches from wear and tear. They carried a deliberate pattern, shallow but intentional. Under magnification, the lines began to resemble letters, as if someone had dragged a sharp object repeatedly into the wood. Analysts debated the shapes, but several appeared to form the beginnings of a name, E.M., followed by unclear marks that could be the rest of her first name. The possibility was horrifying. Emily herself had been confined there, scraping her identity into the boards as proof she existed in those final hours. The theory that emerged was brutal in its simplicity. Emily had been lured back inside the church under the promise of meeting someone she trusted, or perhaps threatened into compliance. She had been led up the narrow stairwell, forced into the crawl space, and sealed inside. The phone messages confirmed her fear, the ledger confirmed access, and the scratches confirmed her presence. What no one could determine was how long she had remained there. Some investigators believed she had died quickly, silenced before she could cry for help. Others argued she may have survived for hours, even days, while life continued outside the tower. The bells above her rang at scheduled times, their vibrations echoing through the wood, a reminder of the world still turning while she lay hidden just beneath. Families who had children in the choir that year were devastated by the revelations. Parents imagined their own sons or daughters singing in the sanctuary while Emily was locked only feet above them, unheard and unseen. For Margaret Harper, the thought was unbearable, that her daughter might have lived long enough to scratch her name into the boards, waiting for someone who never came. The ledger and carvings stripped away the lingering hope of a runaway and replaced it with the reality of confinement. Emily had been trapped, and the tower had held her secret for 15 years. Forensic experts tried to determine if the scratches could be definitively linked to Emily. They examined the depth and style, comparing them to samples of her handwriting and notebooks. While they couldn't prove conclusively, analysts noted similarities in the slant and formation of the letters. The evidence remained circumstantial, but emotionally it was undeniable. To the Harper family and much of the community, it was Emily's voice reaching out from the past, carved in desperation into the only surface available to her. The ledger entry became a symbol of institutional failure. Here was proof that on the night everything unraveled, someone with keys had opened a door that should have stayed sealed. And yet, that information had remained buried for over a decade, dismissed as routine maintenance. Church officials scrambled to explain, insisting they had no knowledge of why the entry wasn't flagged sooner. Former detectives defended their work, saying the ledger had been overlooked among mountains of irrelevant documents, but to the community, it felt like one more missed chance that could have saved Emily, or at least uncovered the truth sooner. As the details spread, outrage grew. Candlelight vigils turned into angry meetings, families demanding accountability for why the tower had never been searched more aggressively in 2009, why the custodian had never been properly questioned, why the ledger had never been treated as evidence until now. Theories spiraled further. Had someone in authority protected him? Had there been an effort to shield the church from scandal? Or was it simply a chain of negligence that allowed a predator to move unchecked? What investigators were left with were fragments, the ledger, the carvings, the phone, that together painted a grim picture. Emily Harper had not vanished into the night. She had been inside the tower, alive long enough to try and leave a mark, silenced long enough for the world to move on without her. As the bells continued to toll in the renovated church, families gathered below them with unease. For 15 years, those bells had marked weddings, funerals, and Sunday services. Now people wondered if every chime had also carried the memory of a girl confined beneath them, waiting for help that never came. Forensic teams worked every angle of the tower and the crawl space, but no amount of analysis could deliver the one piece of evidence everyone hoped for. There were no remains, no bone fragments, no fibers that proved definitively whether Emily had died in that hidden chamber or if she had been taken out afterward. The phone, the ledger, and the scratches gave powerful context, but without a body, there was no conclusive answer. Specialists debated endlessly. Some investigators argued she had likely perished inside the crawl space, pointing to the desperate carvings and the rusted chain as signs she was confined until the end. Others believed she might have escaped or even been removed, only to face harm somewhere else, her final whereabouts lost beyond recovery. Both theories carried weight, and both left unbearable uncertainty for those who had waited 15 years for the truth. The autopsy that never came meant closure that never arrived. The official conclusion of the case was delivered in cautious language. Undetermined, suspicious circumstances. For law enforcement, it was the only category that fit. It acknowledged that Emily's disappearance was not voluntary, that someone else had played a role, but it also admitted there was no definitive cause of death or timeline. In simple terms, it meant the file would remain open, marked by suspicion, but without resolution. For the Harper family, the words felt like a betrayal. They had waded through every false lead, every dead end, every year of silence, only to be told that the truth was unknowable. The announcement fractured the town all over again. Families who had once prayed for certainty argued bitterly about what had happened. Some clung to the belief that Emily had been trapped in the tower until she died, and that her story had been hidden deliberately by someone in power. Others insisted she must have been removed, pointing to the backpack found blocks away years earlier, as evidence she had at least briefly been outside the church. The division was never resolved. Instead, it hardened into two camps, both fueled by grief, both unsatisfied by the vague conclusion handed down by officials. Margaret Harper refused to let the case close quietly. She organized a vigil at the base of the tower, calling on the community to remember Emily not just as a missing girl, but as a daughter stolen from her family. The event drew hundreds, more than anyone expected. Candles lit the churchyard, casting light against the same stone walls where dogs had once traced Emily's scent and lost it. Neighbors, classmates, and strangers stood together, repeating her name into the evening air. It was an act of remembrance, but also an act of defiance, against the silence, against the official language that seemed to surrender. At the end of the vigil, a plaque was unveiled at the base of the tower. Its inscription was short, etched into the metal with stark finality. She sang here once and was silenced here forever. The words cut to the core of the story. Emily had walked into that church as a singer, a student, a daughter, and for reasons that would never be fully understood, she had never walked back out. The plaque was not a resolution, but a marker, a way of saying that even if the truth could not be pinned down, the memory of her would not be erased. For the community, the discovery of the crawl space and the phone changed everything, yet explained nothing. They were left with fragments, objects that pointed toward terror, but did not finish the sentence. A broken flip phone carrying words she never sent. A maintenance ledger with an entry that should never have existed. Scratches in wood that might have been her last attempt to prove she had been there. Each fragment was powerful, haunting, and incomplete. They formed a picture of fear and confinement, but they stopped short of the one answer everyone wanted. What became of Emily Harper? The church resumed its services, though fewer attended. Some families left altogether, unable to step into a building that now carried the weight of secrecy. The tower, once only a backdrop to weddings and funerals, became a monument to uncertainty. Bells rang as they always had, but now each chime sounded different to those who stood below, as though carrying the memory of the girl who may have heard them from inside the crawl space. The sound was no longer simple. It was layered with absence, with a reminder of how close she had been and how far away she remained. Emily Harper's name was added to a statewide missing persons memorial, alongside hundreds of others whose cases remained unsolved. Yet in her town, her story carried a unique weight. It was not just that she had vanished, but that her trail ended in a place sacred to so many, hidden within walls everyone thought they knew. Her case became a lesson in the limits of investigation, in the failures of institutions, and in the way secrets can live in plain sight for years before they are discovered. The mystery endures, not as a story of triumph or closure, but as one of fragments. A girl who sang in the choir, a phone she never had the chance to use, a crawl space that revealed enough to haunt, but not enough to heal. For some, those fragments are all that remains. For others, they are proof that somewhere, hidden still, is the part of the story that will explain everything. Until then, Emily Harper's voice is absent, her fate unresolved, and her name a reminder of how silence can echo for generations.